Good morning and welcome to today's CSA Supplier Member webinar. Today is the turn of Arum with their webinar entitled, Is Your Organization Ready for the Tsunami of Debt on the Horizon? I will now hand you across to today's presenter, Chris Warburton, who will take you through the webinar. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. So welcome everyone. As you just said, I think today we're going to talk a bit about what's expected to be a tsunami of debt that's coming through really as a result of the lockdown and the exit from lockdown. And we've been spending a bit of time looking at this and sort of planning around that. So that's what we're going to cover today. Before I get into it, first I want to explain just a little bit about Arum, who Arum are, and my background as well. So Arum are a consultancy, and we specialize in collections and recoveries consulting really across the credit lifecycle. And we work across the UK, across international, and we spend a lot of time sort of working with clients in terms of what their strategy needs to look like, their systems, and helping them configure their systems. My name, as Mark said, is Chris Warburton. I'm a principal consultant at Arum. I've been with them for 4 years, and before I was doing consulting, I spent a lot of time on the other side in business, running collections and recoveries departments. So today we're going to talk a bit about lockdown, and what our experience has been around lockdown over the last 3 months. And I've been on a couple of the CSA calls since lockdown started, and I know we've all been through quite a process the last few months. And we've sort of used this slide here really to explain what we've seen from a process point of view. And I think there's sort of like 5 real elements. I think when we first started off, we were really in that sort of like react mode. Our concern, and you heard this on the CSA calls, were around safety of staff, social distancing, making sure the staff are safe, making sure we could have business continuity. So, that working from home, being able to work from home, and some of the challenges that came with that. So I remember one of the early challenges was around just physically getting laptops, as an example. Then we sort of went into this response phase, which was really around, okay, now we've got people off-site, now we're up and running, we can actually do some of our basic processes. It's like, well then, how do we start making those processes a little bit more streamlined? So one of the early effects we saw was just a huge wave of calls coming in, as everyone here knows. So how can we start to then automate those processes? Setting up the payment holidays, the payment holiday schemes, they need to be set up within the system. Thinking about credit bureau management as well. Then we went into this sort of like resilience phase, which is then, just thinking around, well, how can we make those processes better? So in terms of like, how do we configure that within the systems, make sure it's going through the systems properly, making sure it's being controlled, thinking a little bit about digital processing. So like, how do we start to create online functionality to make that smoother? And then, do we need to capture, for example, additional data elements? And the last 2 phases, which is really where we kind of think we are today, is also like in this return phase, or this reinvention phase. So the return phase is really around, payment holidays are going to expire. There's going to be the furlough scheme is due to come to an end. What will the impact be on the economy from that, and how will we start to handle that, and how do we start planning for that exit? What's going to happen from a working from home point of view? Are people going to continue to work from home or not? How are we going to manage the return back to the office? So that's the return phase, which is currently being considered. And the last phase is then this reinvention element, which is also going on in the background at the moment, which is people are starting to consider their, target operating model. How do they optimize that? Do they have the right people in the right locations? So looking at things like real estate, and really the whole piece around, can we use this as an opportunity to sort of redesign our customer journeys? So we're in this sort of like transition. I think we've gone through the first 3 phases. There's some risk with the arrow there around whether we get back to the first, just with local lockdowns, but we're really in this sort of like return and reinvention phase. And we've helped clients all the way through this. And I think really what we're talking about now is like this exit playbook, or this exit process, in terms of like, how do we sort of manage that return in a sustainable, controlled way? And really, I think the lockdown process, as we've seen, has really sort of been accelerating just some of the wider trends, I suppose, that we would talk about in the market. And those wider trends that we typically see are around things like technology. And I think over the last few years, we've seen sort of, an investment in technology around intensive use of data, scoring, modeling, those things have been sort of hot topics. Regulatory changes, everyone on this call will definitely know, has been a microscope put on all of us from a regulatory point of view, with dramatic just increases in regulation and scrutiny. And so that's been a trend, I'd say, over the last good few years. There's a trend around customer focus, the financial impacts. So everyone's been trying to do more with less, and demographics. We've got a demographic change where people become much more tech savvy, and those trends are sort of almost like being accelerated to a large extent under COVID. And COVID, I'd say, probably falls into that unknown box, which is something we didn't expect to happen. A lot of people didn't plan for, and yet it's allowed us to basically accelerate things forward. One of the comments when I was on a webinar the other week, and it was actually a supermarket retailer, and they were talking about how digital adoption has been transformed as a result of the lockdown. And it was Microsoft just came back and they said something similar. They said they've had 2 years worth of digital adoption in just 2 months. So really, I think that the lockdown is the trends that we're seeing haven't really changed, but they've been accelerated. A lot of them have been accelerated as a result of lockdown. And so some of the things that we've definitely been seeing is, people are spending time now talking about the exit strategy, and this is why we spend a bit of time looking at this with clients, really around, driven by the end of the payment holiday scheme, but really around data segmentation and how we're going to handle that return back to normal. Acceleration of digital and this digital first strategy, which is like people have used digital to really handle the volume, and it's like, well, now how do we use that as a new normal? And one of the things that's definitely happened is it's given all of us, not just a certain demographic or like younger demographic who would be tending to migrate toward digital. We've seen it really across the board because we've all been forced to use digital and adopt digital. And so now we're more used to it, and so now it's getting more adopted, and we're getting more investment around that as well. Other themes definitely around process controls and then cost efficiency as well. So it's definitely being talked about. So all of this is creating hot topics, and what we just put down on here is just what are the hot topics we're hearing about. So what are people worrying about today? What are people worrying about in the near term? And then what are the things that people are anticipating coming up in the future? So today, I think, is really a question around payment deferrals. What happens? Is there going to be an extension or not? How do we plan those scenarios today? And thinking about capacity planning and hiring or process redesign, really to handle that the volume spike. Some clients have gone out and sort of done significant hiring. Others are really sort of investing in digital. Some are doing a wait and see kind of approach. The other theme that's being talked about now is really around gathering data. So how can data be gathered today that can help us with segmentation as we come out of lockdown? So this is really around, can we gather data today around, what the customer situation is? Are they on furlough? How do we think about, can we take earlier actions to identify they might be in financial difficulties? Because a lot of these customers are sort of already at current, and they look as if everything's fine, but they might be experiencing financial difficulties. So gathering data today is definitely something that's being talked about amongst the people we talk with. Investment in digital readiness. One of the things that's definitely happened as a result of the lockdown, and we've seen is, in collections, as we know, getting investment for new technology or getting investment for changes can often be difficult in collections. That's typically the theme. We see that. One of the benefits, in some ways, unfortunately, of the situation is collections has been front and center of the changes, and we've seen that. And we've been front and center in terms of the volume and some of the impacts and handling it. And so there's definitely been more investment and more change readiness within the collections processes, and that's sort of continuing on. And so people are looking around, well, how can we think about and continue with the investment we've had in digital to create this almost like self-serve digital functionality, really, because we know that it's been on our radar for the longest time, and it's going to help the business, and it's what customers want. Secondly, it's also going to help us get out of what's going to be expected to be a peak of volume as we come out of lockdown. So that's also been talked about in terms of like contact channels, different types of technology, self-serve technology. Other themes that are current conversations. We're seeing quite a lot of collection system upgrades. There's a lot just really around, people just taking a step back and saying, is our technology really suitable for the needs we have now, but also into the future. One of the comments that was made to me was, I think if we'd had the right technology and if we had the right system configuration, some of the early problems we had in terms of volumes coming through and manual workarounds just wouldn't have happened, and they would have been in a much better position from a volume point of view, and a volume handling point of view. So some of that sort of predicated on having the right systems, the right configuration, and that's definitely a theme that's much more top of mind now than it ever has been. I've seen in sort of recent history, at least, anyway. And lastly, around organisational dynamics. I think, as I mentioned, I think, the COVID lockdown has really sort of allowed some of the progress in process development in collection to accelerate. And if you think about, just for example, collections letters typically would take 3 months, maybe even 6 months, with all the various approvals and rewrites to get signed off and get put in the system. You think this time around, with the COVID lockdown, a lot of them were done within weeks, 1 week or even 2 weeks. So there is an ability to be able to make changes quickly if there's the right focus. And a lot of organisations are taking a step back, saying, well, look, how do we keep that going? Obviously, we've got to have the right controls in place, but how do we keep that going in the future? And just thinking about organisational dynamics and also decision making. So I'd say that those 5 are kind of the current hot topics. And then as we sort of go into the future, we sort of talk about, well, what are some of the things that people know on the horizon, and what are people sort of starting to worry about? And the first one there is really around economic impacts. I think the report came out. There's going to be like 700,000 redundancies across the customer base. Across the UK. So economic impacts are definitely top of mind. I think that the view is that it's probably going to happen in the October timeframe. We're waiting to see what's going to happen with, the furlough status in particular. But certainly, we look at notification redundancies. It looks like there's going to be a wave that's coming through. And then the question for us in collections is, well, what does that mean in terms of collections? The other economic impact is going to be, well, what happens if we have, another lockdown, as an example, and will we have sort of geographic type impacts where it impacts particular geographies or even particular industries as well. And having this sort of geographic and sector view is something that people are looking at. Also under economic impacts, I mean, we've seen some quite strange behavior, I suppose, or dynamics going on in terms of some of the markets. So we've obviously saw, the house market pretty much stopped over lockdown, but now it's gone sort of a little bit bananas, and with record house prices largely as a result of the stamp duty cut. Another example would be the motor finance industry, which again suffered. We were expecting to see more of a hit in terms of pricing valuations, but has really sort of seen sort of record prices now in the second-hand car market as a result of people needing a vehicle to be able to get to work. So some of these impacts are sort of changing. Some of them can be a little bit counterintuitive because there's just so many moving parts, but they can have economic impacts on people's business models, and then also as a result their collections processes. So that's being watched quite carefully. Other things that we're expecting to come up will be things around. So there's obviously a backlog in terms of things like debt sale, litigation, repossession, and there's a lot of thought just really around, well, what's going to happen when things start to move again, or things are starting to move, and how will that backlog get processed? Thinking about what will be the timeframes of that, and what are the consequences of that. The other thing that's sort of top of mind is around what happens with a second wave and a re-lockdown. So if we were to go to a full national lockdown again, can we handle that? Are our processes robust enough to be able to handle that? Are our processes digitally ready to be able to process a similar kind of situation? And I think the other aspect is then just what happens with local lockdowns. So we had, one of the first examples was Leicester. I mean, what happened when Leicester closes down, or if it's let's say it was Nottingham, or even sections of London, the businesses in those areas will struggle for business potentially if they don't have a robust strategy. There might be financial difficulties there. They might have people who can't get to work in there, but there'll be a very local, isolated kind of area. But then, from a collections point of view, how do we handle that, and how do we make sure they've got targeted support for those customers? And then lastly, which sort of links into the future element around models and scoring. And this is sort of starting to play out a little bit more, which is just, we've had obviously impacts on the portfolio, and particularly around things like credit bureau reporting. So, people have been on payment holidays, they haven't made payments, and it hasn't impacted their credit bureau. And those are the rules that came out. So we've got this strange kind of reporting that you will be able to see in terms of, people looking slightly different. And I think the question's going to be, both in credit bureaus, but also in terms of internal reporting as well. The question really is around, or the reflection really is around, what does that do to your collection segmentation models? Are they still going to be predictive? Does the scoring still give the same kind of prediction that it did historically? And the view has been very much, well, look, yes, they probably rank order in the same kind of way, but there will be some subtle changes, so that needs to be considered together with things like RFS 9 modelling impacts, and even I think in the future will be around, if they under or over predict, will they have changes that need to be made, for example, on cut-off scores for acquisition. So that's still got to flow through. So then just on the future column, other things that are being talked about now with things like target operating models. So do we have the right people in the right locations, the right number of people, and how do we reimagine what we do if we go to a work from home strategy or versus an all in the office strategy? Other things that are still there is around, well, what happens from a demographic point of view, whether people are in the office or not, how are the population going to change in terms of like readiness for things like contact channels, etc. And then there's the B word, Brexit, which I think I hesitate to mention, but is potentially due at the end of the year. So will that have another impact on the collections processes and on the economy or not? So I think that's also out there as well. And then there are other impacts such as don't forget we've got the breathing space change going in at the start of next year as well. So those are sort of like the main impacts and the main hot topics. And as I sort of think about what our model is in terms of how we think about how we should respond to that, we sort of created this slide here in terms of like known unknowns and unknown unknowns, which is a real mouthful to say, but I think sort of help illustrate just some of the themes we've got to be thinking about. So it's the future sort of breaks out into these four boxes. So first we have the known knowns. So these are things we know about and we know how to handle. So things like, what exact details around the payment holiday date, or the employment so the furlough scheme and the impacts, etc. What the restrictions are. These are things we know about and we know how to handle them. Then we have the known unknowns, which are things that we know how to handle them if we have the data, but we don't quite know what the size of it's going to be. So we have issues or topics such as, what's going to be the long-term wellness or health impacts around COVID, which I think was quite uncertain at the start, probably getting a little bit more known. The collection model piece I just talked about, which is, if we know the details, we know how to handle it, but the details aren't quite clear yet. The exit volumes and circumstances, how quickly we're going to come back, the current forbearance treatment. So we know what to do, but we just don't quite we don't have the data to be able to prove what the best is for the situation. So we're sort of like, we know that we don't know it yet. You know, and things like the future of home working. So what's society going to do? Are we going to be all at home? Are we going to go back to the office? Or are we going to be some sort of hybrid model in between? And then we have the unknown unknowns, which is things like, you know, these are things that we don't quite know yet. So, for example, we don't quite know the extent of the job losses. You know, we don't know, you know, quite the extent of the economic decline. The other things like industry linkages. So the world at the moment is so complex. You have an impact in one industry, it'll have cascade effects through to other industries. And what does that mean from a collections point of view? You know, will there be a second peak? You know, will there be a return? You know, a return from lockdown, or are we going to have, you know, what's the status going to be in terms of, like, you know, society, immunity, etc. And then we have the unknowns, which is just everything's off the table, and these are complete surprises to us. So this model, I think, is quite helpful in terms of, like, categorizing the different topics that we see in the future. And I think as we respond to it, it's almost like the top line is really around, to respond to that, we've got to have data. So we've got to have data to really understand what is the size of the issue. You know, and because if we know the size of the issue, then we can have strategies around it, and we can capacity plan, as an example. The ones on the bottom is really around just understanding trending. So how is it evolving, and understanding, you know, what are the linkages, as an example. So it's really the difference between monitor the data, the detailed data, and then monitor the trends that can give you an insight into the future. And then going to 2 columns down is really around, well, the knowns is really around having robust plans. So as soon as we know it, we can then have a robust plan, because we kind of know what to do. And I think the second piece is the second column is then we don't quite know how it's going to pan out, but we need to be flexible just to be able to make sure that we actually can handle the situation if it goes the way we need to. And that would be an example, for example, of the pandemic. You know, if we had a lot of us didn't have, you know, the exact type of payment holiday configuration within the collection systems. If that had happened, it would have made life an awful lot easier. So think about flexibility and have really good, robust planning, I think, is the summary on that. And so we've obviously, at Arum, we've obviously been working with clients, helping them think a bit about what the exit's going to be. And we produced this playbook, really, which was just our recommendations and thoughts as we worked through with people and observations around what are the key themes that we think are important to think about. And there's a summary on the slide on the screen now. And you know, if you want more detail, you're more than happy to go to the website here and sort of download the full copy as well. So, you know, more than happy to chat further about it. So the 5 themes that we sort of break it out into is really around think a little bit around organization. So that's the first theme, which is, you know, as we exit, think about, you know, first top of mind is really around workplace safety, employee safety, support. You know, can we think about how we would build all of our processes in a virtual world, because that's going to be, thinking digitally is going to be fairly future-proof. How do we think about speed of decision making and compliance in the new world, and then obviously then just revisiting business continuation plans if something else happens or we go back into re-lockdown. The second theme is then really around strategy analytics, or collection strategy and analytics. And this is really around, like, how do we think now around proactively contacting customers? Gathering data now is probably one of the best things we can do, because it's going to give us information to segment in the future to work out who's really in financial difficulties versus not, who's a good customer who will get back on their feet versus those who might be in financial, you know, longer term financial difficulties. And gathering the information from them today will help us in the future. You know, building digital customer journeys, reinforcing the vulnerable process. We have some people who are going to be in quite a lot of stress, you know, including financial hardship. And then just starting to plan around these potential collection model impacts. Third theme is then just really around technology. You know, how do you maximize your current technical capability today using your existing infrastructure? Then it starts thinking around, well, then can we create digital channels, start to think about automation, and how do you start to enhance that is going to enable the flexibility in the future? And thinking about things like working from home infrastructure. As an example, do you have a hybrid or a hybrid model if you want to start bringing people back that's going to be flexible? Should we have another re-lockdown? The fourth element then is really around operation execution. And obviously, say top of mind is around making sure you got the well-being amongst your workforce, making sure they're safe on site if people do come back. But then really it's around having the right capacity, doing the capacity planning, making sure you got the flexibility to be able to handle the volume that's expected to come through as a result of this tsunami of arrears that we're expecting. Investing in things like hardship portals or automated I&E has been a big sort of time saver that can help with capacity for sure. And then lastly is then, well, what's the plan to handle expected backlog volumes, once some of these processes restart? And then lastly is really around performance management. So we've put in all these changes that have been put in place. A lot of them have been put in place very quickly. How do you measure the impact of that, and how do you measure the impact and forecast what the performance is going to be going forward? So, for example, do we have track those who've had real COVID issues versus not, and the blend of scenarios that will happen in between? Thinking a bit about post-change controls. So a lot of the changes that were put in at the start in particular were put in very, very quickly. Do you need to go back and just consider, were they the right changes? Were they the optimal changes? And is the right documentation, the right evidence to make sure that you can demonstrate that those are the right things, that the right decisions were done, and potentially there might even be remediation that needs to be done as well. So, but doing that now is going to really help you, because you're not going to be snowed under if you do have issues later on. Thinking about new KPIs, particularly if in a working from home environment, and we're not thinking that they're necessarily going to change hugely, but what we do think will happen is you just got to be conscious around the situation that people are in, and so having a refresh around the KPIs is definitely worth looking at. And then flexible action plans, performance triggers, and then the RFS 9 and financial impacts as well. So I say we've been sort of using this framework really to sort of guide people around where are good places to look, what are some of the things to think about, and obviously helping them build some of those plans. If you want a little bit more detail, there's a document. So just go to the link shown on the screen, and we're happy to sort of take you through that. So that's it really. I'm happy to take any questions. I think we are expecting there to be significant changes coming through the next couple of months. I think it's everyone is expecting there be significant volumes of arrears coming through. I think there's obviously a spectrum between the level of sophistication and investment that's gone in terms of like preparedness for that. But I do think it's worth thinking about and preparing for significant increase in volume in the next couple of months really. So I hope that's been helpful. And Mark, I'm happy to take any kind of questions really.
Cheers, Chris. We'll just give people a few seconds to see if any questions are submitted. There haven't been any as yet, but if anyone does have any questions, please send them through. We have about a minute remaining, so if people do submit questions and we don't have time to answer, we will get back to you, or we will put them up with the links on our website to this webinar as well. So I'll just give people a few seconds and then situation.
What I'd also say, Mark, is if people do come up with questions afterwards, then obviously just go to the Arum website. I mean, we're very easy to get in contact with, and we're always happy to discuss these things further, or answer any questions sort of directly. I mean, we're fairly easy to find. So but the lifeblood of these conversations, of these kind of issues, is having conversations and talking about really trying to help people to what's going on and talking about what's going on as well. So more than happy to field any questions even after the session is done as well. So
that sounds like a rather a sensible suggestion there, Chris. There don't seem to be any questions come through at the moment, so I'd like to thank you, Chris, for
You're welcome.
It was a very interesting and informative webinar there today. So everyone who's listening, I'd like to remind you all that today's webinar will be made available on the CSA website from tomorrow if you'd like to listen again, or if you want to recommend it to colleagues who weren't available today. Finally, before you go, we'd appreciate it if you would take a few seconds to give feedback on today's webinar in the relevant area provided. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for your time today. Take care and goodbye.